Do you hate baseball media blackouts? I know that I do. You ever wondered why we are still dealing with that problem? It's infuriating. You want to watch your local team, but they're blacked out. It makes you wonder why you pay for the digital service in the first place. Well, the problem has to do with territorial media rights, which frankly make no sense in many cases. Now, it might surprise you to know that the history of territorial rights in baseball goes back a long way. If you haven't noticed before, the American and Canadian sports model is completely different from the rest of the world. For example, take a look at association football in England. You've got two major clubs in Manchester, Manchester United and Manchester City. There's also FC United of Manchester, a lower division club formed by fans opposed to Malcolm Glazer and his ridiculous business practices. So that makes 3 professional teams in a city with under 600,000 residents. This happens because the clubs are businesses independent of one another. They are in competition, and as a result, there is no need to respect territorial rights. American sports are different. In fact, whenever you see cities with 2 teams in the same sport, you're most likely looking at the accident of history instead of at a carefully planned business decision. This is obvious if you look at the history of the American League. There was only one Major Baseball league back in 1899. This was the National League. The owners voted to contract 4 teams at the end of that season. Now, that itself is an obvious case of monopolistic action, and it was incredibly unpopular with the public and with the press. Ban Johnson took action right away. He moved one of the clubs in his Western League to Cleveland. That's the city that the National League had just abandoned. Johnson also set up a deal to get a club placed in Chicago. Now, the details of this are sketchy, but it seems that he somehow convinced President Hart of the Chicago National League Club that the best way to prevent the old American Association from coming back to compete with the National League was to let Johnson have a minor league team in Chicago. Johnson then promptly renamed his old Western League to the American League. He then fought to ensure that his players couldn't be drafted away from the National League teams for cheap during the season, like players in the other minor leagues could. Now, what Ban Johnson did was absolutely a breach of the territorial rights of the Chicago National League Club. In fact, when you dig into the newspapers, it becomes hilariously obvious what Johnson was doing. We don't talk very much about this today, but the Chicago White Stockings actually drew more fans than the Chicago National League Club did in 1900. The National League side that year was an awful team. The White Stockings, meanwhile, were contenders from the start. But the important thing here is not this trivial point. The important thing here is this concept of territorial rights. When the American League became a self-proclaimed major league in 1901, Johnson quickly moved teams into National League cities that were struggling for attendance. This was Boston and Philadelphia. Then, after they finished dead last in 1901, the Milwaukee Brewers franchise was transferred to another National League town. This was St. Louis. And of course, as many of you know, the old Baltimore Orioles eventually went to New York, where they established a dynasty. Now, these moves directly infringed upon the established territorial rights of the National League. They were acts of war, and it was a war that Ban Johnson just about won. The only way that the National League could stay alive was convincing John McGraw and more than half of the 1902 Baltimore Orioles to join the New York Giants late that season. In other words, territorial rights are very important in the American sports system. This is one reason why you're not going to see the blackouts go away anytime soon. In fact, territorial rights were a huge headache for baseball owners even back in the early days of television. Now, the worry in the late 1940s was the opposite of the worries that owners have today. Back then, minor league teams, especially in the Pacific Coast League, were concerned that coast-to-coast baseball broadcasts would cause people to stop attending local games. It doesn't seem that anybody thought the PCL could compete by offering its own product on television, however. The interesting thing is that today's problem is the inverse of the PCL problem. Major League Baseball teams today don't really care that much if you're watching a stream of a game from somebody else's territorial market, but they do care if you are watching streams of games from their territorial market. To understand this, we need to take a look at the history of baseball on cable television. As many of you remember, 2 baseball teams established cable television superstations in the late 1970s. This would have been the Chicago Cubs on WGN and the Atlanta Braves on TBS. This led to a huge imbalance in media revenue and also in fan attention. Teams that were able to establish cable television networks that stretched across the country suddenly were attracting fans from far-flung places. And of course, the teams that didn't have those types of superstation networks were at a major competitive disadvantage. That imbalance was the subject of a lot of discussion, such as this excellent 1994 book by Andrew Zimbalist. Now, obviously, teams with more revenue could buy better players and create a better product on the field, which would lead to even more future revenue. Now, the best illustration we have of this is actually college football, right? The SEC and the Big Ten, because of the television packages, have become super conferences. In other words, they have access to more revenue than the clubs that are in other college football conferences. Because of that, top prospects have a huge incentive to attend schools in the SEC and in the Big Ten. Why? Because they get more attention nationally than players who are attending schools not in those conferences. That leads to a major competitive balance problem. Of course, there is a way around this. The NFL's media contract ensures that regular season broadcasts are handled by the league, not by individual teams. The money is then divided up evenly, leading to greater financial parity and, in theory, to greater parity on the field. But that's a place that baseball has never gone. And actually, there is a bigger problem that's lurking in the distance, and it's one that many people are ignoring. Well, the problem is simple. People just don't watch television like they used to. Back in, say, 2006 or so, cord cutting was seen as a temporary trend. Today, however, it's more than a temporary trend. Okay, I don't have a television. I've never purchased television service in my life. My children don't watch television. When we go on vacation in a hotel, they like to watch TV for the commercials because they don't watch commercials. If we want to watch something live at home, we don't watch TV, we stream it. And that's really what major sports on television are competing with. They're competing with pirated streams of their own product, streams that generally are in better quality than the official stream, streams that are free from blackout restrictions, and streams that are not going anywhere. Now, we should back up here. The reason why you see these blackouts is because of the contracts that teams have with local regional sports networks. This regional sport network system emerged chiefly after the 1994 strike. It was a regional system that was designed to combat the super networks. All baseball games were put on the air through contracts between teams and regional sports networks. The networks would then sell the rights to air the broadcast to cable and satellite television providers, who would in turn sell the product to the customers in packages. That system is designed to funnel viewers through cable and satellite television providers, who in turn charge a premium to watch the games. In many cases, any given provider who carries the network is the sole provider in a certain geographic area. What this means is that the television provider can charge monopolistic prices. Teams would not allow you to stream games within the established geographic rights boundary because they would then be competing with the cable and satellite providers. They don't want to hurt themselves that way. There's also a free lunch element here. It's a little bit nuanced, and I'll give you an example. We used to live in an apartment in Vienna, Virginia. We were there about a year. Our rent at that apartment included what they called free cable. Of course, it wasn't actually free. What was happening is part of our rent went to the cable company for basic cable. This was a non-negotiable part of the rent, which was controlled by a large company in the complex we lived in. We didn't have a television, we never used the cable service, but you know what? It didn't matter, because the Mid-Atlantic Sports Network always received a certain amount of money from us every month through this system. It was part of our rent. This despite the fact that we never tuned in or even hooked up the service. And it wasn't just in that apartment complex. The HOA that is across the street from where I live has the same type of setup. This is a major issue throughout the United States, and one that most people don't talk a lot about. And really, that's the reason why this system developed. It allowed teams to make a consistent profit no matter what. Even if the on-field product was lousy, even if nobody tuned in, the exclusive contract guaranteed that the team would receive a certain amount of money. Unless, of course, people start cutting the cord in great numbers. Because what happens then is the advertising money and the money for the subscriptions no longer goes to the cable and satellite television providers, and then the baseball teams start feeling this in the pocketbook. And then you have a real problem. Now, baseball broadcasts have become stale and predictable over the past couple decades, and this has happened largely because of this free lunch phenomenon. The money would just roll in, which meant that nobody needed to pay any attention to the quality of the broadcast or even the quality of the product on the field. But now that many of these regional networks are going bankrupt thanks to cord cutting, reality is going to hit the sport very hard. Now, I do think that there's a way out of this mess, but this will require Major League Baseball to admit something that we've long suspected is actually true. You see, the truth is that baseball isn't actually the product here. The fans are the product, and the advertisers are the true customers. Now, there are a few schemes popping up here and there to try to get fans to subscribe to local streaming services. For example, for about $20 a month, you can get blackout free streams of the Red Sox and Bruins games if you're in the Boston area. That might not seem too bad, but there are many reports of issues with service quality. And of course, we live in the golden age of piracy. These days, it's easier to pirate live sports than it's ever been. So what should we do? How do we get out of this mess? Well, this is what I propose. Treat baseball broadcasts as advertising. Instead of charging for it, give it away for free. And yes, this is a tacit admission that baseball fans themselves are really the product. Now, this used to work. Teams wouldn't stick every single game on television in those days. A few games a year would be broadcast, enough to get casual fans and curious people interested, but not so much that the market was oversaturated with baseball. You see, baseball's biggest problem today is apathy. Former hardcore fans of the sport have been leaving in droves, especially because of ridiculous rule changes. Charging fans for your product works if you've got fans. But as baseball's fan base continues to age, and as young people continue to find other activities more engaging, baseball's relevance will continue to diminish. Actually, teams tried to charge for broadcasts once upon a time. The Chicago White Sox had a pay-per-view scheme with Sportsvision starting in 1982. That scheme was a huge failure, and it just so happened to coincide with the rise of the Crosstown Cubs on WGN. Now, honestly, I don't see why this sort of pay-per-view plan would succeed today after it failed back then. People really are not interested in paying for a monthly subscription service just to watch a sport. In 1983, the White Sox finished in first place, but their television subscription package had less than 20,000 subscribers in a major metro area. It's not that much different today. And of course, today, unlike 1983, it's really, really easy to pirate this stuff, and the pirate streams are not going anywhere. Well, for the time being, we're probably going to be stuck with these frustrating blackouts, but I seriously think that this will change soon. And if it doesn't, baseball will continue to fade into obscurity.